I'd like to introduce our other panelists who will be discussing the aerospace industry. Our first panelist is Jason Cox, president of Cox Machine Incorporated. Give a little wave there, Jason. And our second panelist is Dave Franson, president and owner of Franson Consulting Incorporated. Please join me in welcoming both. We'll give Richard a little breather and begin with Dave. What is the future for the light aircraft segment of the industry, especially as it relates to owner-flown airplanes, the kind that were once emblematic of Wichita, flight schools and flying clubs?
Well, owner-flown airplanes are little airplanes all the way up to like the Learjets and the Textron jets, but specifically, Richard doesn't get down into the little airplanes, the kind that we learned to fly in, and I think we ought to talk about that a little bit too, because those are airplanes that we used to build in such quantities that when I learned to fly back in the 70s, we built at Cessna, we turned out 30 of them a day, if you can believe that. We had a year in the late 70s, I think it was 1978, where the industry actually built 17,000 airplanes that were piston-powered airplanes for the most part, and some light jets. But let's talk about those little airplanes just a little bit, Stephanie, if we can, because it's an interesting segment that's been kind of almost ignored in the past. It's the segment that was hit by the product liability concerns in the 80s, and if you remember, those of you who are old enough to remember, it literally ceased production for a while. In the 1970s, when I learned to fly in a Cessna 172 before product liability was a big concern, and that airplane that I learned to fly in was a nice little four-place airplane, and it cost $25,000 to buy one. You can still buy a Cessna 172 now. It's been revived in its production, and they build them down in Independence, Kansas, but it lists for $400,000 plus. The airplane still performs about the same way. It's a 125-mile-an-hour airplane, four places, and it's a nice little airplane. Why do I bring that up? Well, it's a concern because that's the kind of airplane you learn to fly in. And so if you're going to learn to fly these days, and you go to a Cessna Pilot Center or somewhere else to learn to fly, you're probably going to learn to fly in an airplane that averages over 30 years of age. Why is that a concern? Well, because we're also developing capabilities in avionics and in the next generation air traffic system, the capabilities using satellite navigation and so on and so forth are going to make all of those airplanes that have the old systems, the old analog avionics in them, obsolete, and they won't be able to operate. So what's happening with that? And that's a concern that we all have, because it means that we're going to have to come up with a different way to train pilots. In the old days, when I was learning to fly, people were coming out of the military in large numbers, and they were literally populating the airlines, and a lot of the other military pilots were going into private flying and so on and so forth, corporate aviation. So there were lots of people to take care of those concerns. We don't have those kind of people now. So what we do have is a concern about where do we get airplanes to take care of the flying clubs, the flight training schools. There's a couple of answers to that, I guess. One of them, one of our own local companies, Yingling Aviation, has developed a plan, and what they do is they're offering to buy a certain segment of those old 172s, probably the one I learned to fly in back in the 70s, and they'll buy that airplane. It may be a run-out airplane where they've got engines that have a lot of hours on them, and the airplane's pretty worn out, and they'll strip it down, and they'll take the engine out, and they'll take the propeller off it, they'll take the wheels and brakes off it, they'll strip it down, all the paint off it, and they'll recondition the entire paint job and everything. They'll take it all the way down to the bare rivets. It'll be stripped down and the wings will be taken off. They'll just look at it as if it's going down to almost, well, back to the way it was. It hasn't been torn down to that level since it was built. And they will recondition it, and they'll literally put new wheels and brakes on it. They'll rewire it. They'll put new avionics in it with some glass so that it'll operate in the next generation air transportation system. They'll put a rebuilt prop, a rebuilt engine on it. They'll put new avionics in it. They'll put the new interior in it. They'll paint it. And you put that airplane up against the new 172, and side by side, they look identical or very close to it. They'll perform pretty much the same way. The difference is they paid a very small price for the run-out airplane, and a refurbished airplane doesn't cost nearly as much to actually rebuild, and so it's about half the price. It's about a $200,000 investment. So a flying club with half a dozen people in it are sharing the price of a $200,000 investment as opposed to a $400,000 investment, and a flight school can buy that airplane for half the price in investment of the new one. So Cessna will give you a fleet price on the new airplane. They'll cut the price below maybe that $400,000 list price if you buy several of them. But those are the kind of things that we're having to look at for the very light learn-to-fly type airplanes. And that's a concern because we've got a whole lot of people we've got to put into the pilot population in the next few years.
All right, thank you, Dave. I'll just catch a ride in your plane and save money that way.
All right.
Our next question is for Jason. Richard touched on this a little bit, but what do you think? Have we reached the top of the twin aisle market?
Yeah, Richard did a good job talking about that, I think. When I think about the twin aisle market, personally, I'm thinking about the 777 and the A330. I think the 380 and the 747 kind of have their own market, which is really weak, that the large planes aren't selling. And then the Airbus 350 and the 787 are composites, so they have that going for them. It's a little different market. But as far as the 777 and the corresponding Airbus 330, Boeing just recently announced that they would not expand 777 production unless they had a whole lot of new orders. And I think the answer is yes. The short answer, it seems to be topped out on those aircraft. There's only so much demand for those long range aircraft, and it seems to be growing in the single aisles, as Richard talked about. But the twin aisles is maybe not the best place for growth now.
So how can manufacturers prepare then for the inevitable down cycle? And feel free, anyone chime in on this.
Yeah, strangely, I was just a couple of weeks ago at a group talking about exactly that. Jeff Turner was there giving us some advice. I think the main thing when you're preparing for the inevitable down cycle that you said is 21? is not to have the company over leveraged on the upside. So during the upside, if a manufacturing company, and I'm not saying don't borrow any money. I've got a lot of banker friends out there, lots and lots of you, and don't borrow any money. I think that borrowing money is an important part of the growth of the business. But if you consider what would happen if your revenue was cut in half of its current level, and see if that withstands the stress test with how much money you're willing to borrow. I think that's the best way that manufacturers can protect themselves and be in a position where if things do change or if the market falls off, because when it falls off, it doesn't seem to fall off gently, it seems to fall off rapidly. And if you are in a position of leverage in your company where you can feel comfortable about being able to sustain it on the downside, then I think that's a good place to be.
You should leverage your company. Actually, you think about it, that's exactly right, of course, but there is this fundamental contradiction that, as I'm sure you know, being in the real world, probably is at the heart of the difficulty of running a company and preparing for the downturn, because on the one hand, leverage will kill you in a time when revenues decline. You got to be careful about that. On the other hand, the other advice I'd give you is diversify and bring in new program business to expose yourself to different segments of the industry. What does that take? Capital, investment, leverage. You got to really thread that needle between the two, don't you? You live this in real life, but you know, that's the tricky part of it.
All right, another question for Jason. How does Airbus's backlog affect Wichita's economy and employment?
Airbus has, besides the manufacturing that Spirit does on some aircraft product, there's the design center here, of course. So the Airbus Design Center employs lots of folks in Wichita. So we think about, you know, Boeing was a legacy here for so long, and Spirit builds so much Boeing product that we think about Boeing when we think about commercial aircraft in Wichita. And Airbus is playing a larger and larger role here. Airbus is, I can tell you as a manufacturer, Airbus is more difficult to get the qualifications you need to build parts for. It's a longer, more difficult process. And so, you know, companies like ours and a handful of others in Wichita have been working on that for years and have finally achieved all of those qualifications. So Spirit builds a little bit of Airbus content, but the smaller players in the supply chain, like companies our size, are now able to be active in that market and support Airbus products. So I think that whatever happens with Airbus isn't just in France anymore, or it's not just in Alabama. I mean, whatever's happening now also affects Wichita, and I think that's important for us to consider.
I would ask Richard then, is Spirit well positioned to grow its aerostructures work?
Yeah, you know, absolutely. It's a funny thing about this business. The very high barriers to entry you see at the top are pretty much reflected right on down through the supply chain. In other words, when you look at these sort of tier one super integrators in the aerostructures business, they're not making any more of them. Actually, the experience of VOT shows that maybe we're making fewer of them. It's once you get that critical mass and once you get that expertise, it's very tough for newcomers to come at you. I mean, right now you've just got the Japanese heavies, you've got the Italians at Finmeccanica, which has been renamed Leonardo, because the CEO is the only human being on the planet who hasn't heard of Leonardo DiCaprio, but that's another story. And then you've got GKN over in Britain, and also over here. But Spirit is pretty much in that very, very top tier. And once you're there, it's a good place to be, to go out there and pursue that. The one problem that Spirit had is when they transitioned from a cost center at Boeing to a P&L center as an independent company. And on the good side, they went out and booked a lot of new business, you know, back in the 2000s. The bad news is some of it wasn't priced correctly, or some of it didn't factor in the associated technical risks. So I think moving forward, they've got to find a way, again, to thread that needle. But in terms of their position, it's really excellent.
Mm-hmm. Dave, you mentioned the number of pilots. Are we truly facing a pilot shortage crisis? And if so, how can it be addressed if the typical training fleet is being depleted and or becoming obsolete?
Well, I think that we are facing a pilot shortage. I wanted to go to dinner with these guys last night, but I actually have a Wichita Aeroclub luncheon at noon today with probably the people that have trained more pilots in the world than anybody, John and Martha King. They own the King Schools, which actually is a organization that uses video. They started the flight training video business back in the late 70s, and then it's blossomed, and so more people have been trained in the world by King videos than just about anybody. And we talked a lot about the fact that there are a lot of airlines and a lot of other corporate flyers and so on and so forth that are at a point where they need a new generation of pilots. And where are we going to get some of those people? And so there's a definite recognition that there are new pilots that need to be trained, and where are we going to get those? Pilot training is probably taking a different approach. Now, of course, we've got devices that can be used and computerized training capabilities and programs and so on that help, and obviously there's the use of simulation that can be utilized to help. But the reality is training airplanes are still a big part of it, and you have to log some time in the airplanes if you're going to be able to train. And so we are looking at ways to increase that fleet. The government has done some things. They've relaxed the third-class medical requirement, and so you can look forward to pilots that won't necessarily have to get that medical going forward. They can fly if they have a decent medical report and they have a driver's license and so on. But there are light sport airplanes, the kind of airplanes that don't necessarily meet the same weight requirements and power requirements. But those are not the kind of airplanes that are going to actually fill the void for training aircraft too. So we've got some challenges on our hands when it comes to teaching people to fly, and there's a need to be creative when it comes to adding to the number of pilots.
All right. This question, I'd be interested to hear what all of you think of this. Can Wichita and Kansas retain their status among the world's aerospace clusters, or has that status already been lost?
Well, I'll take that one on first, and I definitely want to have Jason and Richard comment too. But I think that Wichita owns the air capital of the world title, and I don't think we're going to give it up anytime soon. But there are 5 aircraft clusters or aviation clusters, and Richard can certainly talk to this a little bit better than probably anybody else in the world. But we own that title for one very good reason. We've produced more than 300,000 airplanes, and I think the city that would be second in terms of number of airplanes produced is probably Los Angeles, and they're not building any anymore. And I think I just heard Richard say that the last California-based airplane was a C-17, and they delivered the last one. Is that right, Richard?
Last jet.
Yeah. So we're going to keep that title on the basis of volume in terms of number of airplanes, probably forever. But what else have we got going for us? Well, we've got a number of things going for us. We continue to have that talent base as long as we've got the companies that are here that build these airplanes, the people that have populated these companies for years, and the leadership that we have in terms of bending metal and building airplanes continues to be here. We want to continue to retain that. Now, we've had a loss of some talent from 2008 until now. We saw a decline in our population of workers. It went down by, I think at one point, down about 13,000 people. We didn't recover a lot of those jobs. Some of them are gone forever. But in the meantime, we have developed the Wichita Area Technical College and what we now call the National Center for Aviation Training. It's a world-class facility. And if you don't believe it, you should go out and visit and see what it has become. We also have the National Institute for Aviation Training at Wichita State. Wichita State is also developing its innovation campus. Those are world-class. Wichita State's National Institute for Aviation Training, or Institute for Aviation Research, has that facility out at what was the Kansas Coliseum, which is unmatched anywhere in the world when it comes to doing the kind of testing that they do. We're world-class in those types of things, and that gives us a capability to attract people, to attract contracts, to attract all types of things that will continue to give us an edge as an aviation mecca, I think, and to continue to facilitate our industry and going forward. To top it all off, companies like Jason's and like the ones that serve our manufacturers here are world-class as well, and we've got a lot of them, and they kind of fly under the radar, to use an aviation metaphor, and people don't even realize that they're here, but we've got a lot of them, and they're better than anywhere else in the world.
Dave took all my answers, that's good. I'm a pretty optimistic guy in general, and so I think that no, we haven't lost it, and yes, we can keep it here. We absolutely can. We've got a huge talent base, we've got a huge manufacturing base. You just mentioned, NIAR's been doing the right things out there for a long time. NCAT is also moving in the right direction. It's a fantastic facility, as Dave just said. I mean, that's the kind of attention that we need and the attention that's going on. Airbus is moving the design center to co-locate with the new WSU facility. So these are the things that are going to drive the innovation, I think. And I don't know. There's this whole idea about the fourth manufacturing revolution, and I don't know if that's a new idea yet, but it's sometimes called Industry 4.0, and if you're in Europe, it's Industry 4.0 with an IE. But the first industrial revolution was what we call the Industrial Revolution with mechanization and steam. The second one was interchangeable parts and assembly lines, Henry Ford type of stuff. The third one's in the 80s when you had the advent of computer control of machinery and robotics. And so now there's this idea of the fourth revolution, which is going to drive the entire economy, not just here, but we are well positioned here to take advantage of it. And the fourth revolution is the idea of connected devices, or the Internet of Things, or a lot of other acronyms that you could use, where the machinery and the robots and all the automation equipment and your information systems all talk to each other all the time in real time. And the challenge there is all the equipment. I mean, a lot of the equipment that's in our shop now already has this capability. The new generation of equipment has the ability to put out this kind of data. The real question is in the big data and the analytics side, and what do you do with all of this? Because when you've got every machine in your shop and every robot talking to you, every 30 milliseconds, I mean, it's a teenager on Instagram. There's too much data. And so how do we take all of that and reduce it down into something that's digestible and important and usable at the location where it needs to be used? And I think Wichita is well positioned, both from a manufacturing and a technical side, to take advantage of that revolution. So.
Right. We're almost out of time, but Richard, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, this is definitely the exam question, isn't it, from the standpoint of this conference? And a couple things hit me. I'll make it quick because we're out of time. But one lesson I think I took away from the 2008 collapse over here, the aerospace collapse, is that, first of all, I still think of Wichita as the air capital of the world. Nothing has changed. On the other hand, it shows the importance of diversification, because Wichita had a greater dependence upon one particular market segment than most of the other great clusters of the world. So again, getting back to the virtue of Jason's company, it's important to have more subcontractors that are exposed to a broader portfolio of businesses and a global portfolio of businesses, Airbus and whatever else, rather than just cranking out King Airs. Love the King Air, but you just can't be too dependent upon one segment of the market. Like all people in the economics realm, I look at manufacturing 4.0 and I think, wow, great promise. Obviously shows the importance of training and education, big part of that. But I also think that you could find that jobs don't come back in line with this cluster, because of course so much of this trend in manufacturing involves, fewer workers fewer machinist type workers, and more, software engineers and folks like that. They just don't have the same numbers. But in terms of the importance of Wichita to the global aerospace economy, I don't have any doubt that it's here to stay.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating. Let's give them a round of applause.